Pax Tube is a self-described Catholic YouTuber and social critic with about 100,000 subscribers. His first video up on YouTube is Why the US is Not a Nation of Immigrants, followed promptly by Why People Like Anime Girls.
Slim or curvaceous bodies.
His most popular video with 2.5 million views, so much bigger than Zoomer Historian, is Why the Crusades Were Awesome, Actually. What a great first impression. But if you dig a little deeper, like look up the guy on Twitter, you'll see that, believe it or not, he's completely obsessed with Jewish people too, not in a good way. I can't read this stuff out loud because the last time I did, YouTube deleted my video for hate speech, but trust me, this is pretty hateful stuff from a pretty big YouTube channel. Pax Tube is part of the trad cath phenomenon, far-right wackos who cloak their hatreds in Catholicism, even though the Catholic Church obviously condemns all hatred and all violence committed in the name of God, including the Crusades and the Inquisition. Zoomer Historian is one of these trad caths too, alongside bigger figures. So let's debunk Pax Tube. Let's go through a couple of his videos and show how he lies about history to serve his own ideological ends. But before we begin, if you like this sort of video, why not subscribe? I'll definitely make another of these on somebody else. And since this video may be demonetized by YouTube, check out my Patreon and get a sneak peek at the script for another 2 debunks of Pax Tube for just $1 a month. But okay, let's start with Pax Tube's first video. Why the United States is not a nation of immigrants, every fact you need to know. To just quickly state my main problems with the video, Pax Tube basically forgets that white people can be immigrants. He obviously has a problem with non-white immigrants today and would prefer immigration to be restricted to just Europeans or completely. But he has to construct this weird historical fantasy to argue that immigration was never important to America before 1965, which is just factually untrue. Where did everyone come from? Let's see how he opens.
If you've looked at United States politics at any time in the last few decades, you've likely heard the phrase that the United States is a nation of immigrants. This phrase has been echoed by both Democrats and Republicans for quite some time, and is most often used in the context of defending mass immigration into the United States. The phrase has its origins in the late 1950s, where it was heavily promoted by the Anti-Defamation League, an international NGO. Ultimately, a book titled A Nation of Immigrants was sponsored by this organization and released by John F. Kennedy in 1958.
Okay, so what a fun start to the video. Quick nitpick from a historical perspective. JFK didn't invent the term Nation of Immigrants. It was popularized by him, but if you scroll through Google Scholar, you can see mentions before
late 1950s,
both in favor and against. And I wonder if JFK got his idea specifically from somewhere. Well, yeah, on page 2 he quotes Alexis de Tocqueville's 1831 book, Democracy in America, a good look into the culture of America at the time from the POV of a foreigner. JFK remarks, what Alexis de Tocqueville saw in America was a society of immigrants, each of whom had begun life anew on an equal footing. This was the secret of America, a nation of people with the fresh memory of old traditions who dared to explore new frontiers, people eager to build lives for themselves in a spacious society that did not restrict their freedom of choice and action. I think that's a pretty good thing. So while the ADL published a pamphlet by JFK, who then published a book, pinning this whole idea on just a Jewish group kind of reveals a little bit of your bias, doesn't it? It wasn't just the ADL, it was JFK, and it was the 81% of senators and 77% of representatives who voted to liberalize immigration in 1965, which was the policy JFK was advocating for.
To realize that we are the descendants of 40 million people who left other countries, other familiar scenes, to come here to the United States to build a new life, to make a new opportunity for themselves and their children. I think it is not a burden, but a privilege.
Also, I thought trad caths would like Kennedy since he was the first Catholic president, but I guess he wasn't very traditional. Anyways.
Things began in the colonial period. Most of the first successful settlers that arrived in the land that would become the United States arrived in the early 1600s. These included English, French, Scottish, Spanish, Dutch, and Scandinavian colonists, among others. What all of these colonists had in common was that they were arriving to a land that had very little infrastructure, It was an incredibly dangerous and risky environment.
Let's fast forward a bit through the video.
So, here's what should be underlined about this time period. Firstly, the settlers were not arriving to a well-established country. They were arriving to what was largely wilderness, and they faced threats of famine, weather, and Native American attacks. Secondly, the majority of these settlers were coming from Europe. The English, French, and Spanish would go on to dominate the Americas. Those coming to colonial America who were not from Europe were for the most part slaves brought from Africa. However, it's important to point out the scale. Slaves comprised less than 5% of the 13 colonies' population until the year 1690, almost 80 years after the first colony was established.
Okay, his third point is that the colonies didn't need strict immigration laws centuries ago because the sea journey killed so many people. I'll talk more about that in a second, but let's talk about his first point. What exactly is an immigrant? Well, in his book, JFK writes, "Another way of indicating the importance of immigration to America is to point out that every American who ever lived, with the exception of one group, that'll be the Native Americans, was either an immigrant himself or the descendant of immigrants, the Nation of Immigrants." So in JFK's language, an immigrant is anyone who moves to a new land. Pax Tube is using it differently. He writes it's someone who moves to a firmly established country. Stay with me for a minute because this is the basis of his entire argument, and is a pretty important discussion about the nature of the origins of America. What is a firmly established country specifically? Are we counting colonies as firmly established countries? The 13 colonies weren't independent, but they were part of the British Empire, which was a firmly established country. There were definitely organized societies in the 13 colonies. They had cities, they had everything like that. Think about the case of Puerto Rico today, which isn't a country, but a territory of America. But people who moved there from, say, Mexico should definitely still be counted as immigrants. In that case, people who moved to the 13 colonies should probably still be counted as immigrants, right? Even if they weren't independent countries. I think to be charitable, we can cross off country with this definition and put in society, which makes more sense as he's using it. I think there's a very strong argument to make that the first English colonists who arrived on the eastern seaboard weren't exactly immigrants as we understand them today, but colonists establishing a new society among the remnants of indigenous societies nearly wiped out completely by diseases. So the first colonists weren't quite immigrants. But at what point do colonists become immigrants? Well, as Pax Tube's definition suggests, when the colonies become firmly established. But when did that happen? Well, like we talked about with Puerto Rico, it must have happened long before 1776. Maybe we can just focus on New England for a second. By the 1670s, New England was definitely a firmly established society. You had wee old cities like Boston, you had New Englanders kicking out Native Americans with King Philip's War. Even using Pax Tube's definition, anyone who migrated into New England after about 1670 was an immigrant and not a settler. Can we agree on that? Does that make sense? Okay, so if that's the case, that's millions upon millions of immigrants just in New England. And if JFK is to be understood, their offsprings too are part of the idea of the Nation of Immigrants. Same story for the rest of the East Coast, and eventually the rest of America too, from sea to shining sea. Let's get some numbers. Even before the Declaration of Independence, hundreds of thousands of Europeans migrated to the 13 colonies, chiefly Brits, but also tens of thousands of Germans too. Surely we can agree that at least a massive percentage of this 500,000 people are immigrants. Anyways, I could keep researching stats, but I don't think Pax Tube, or anybody really, if pressed for 1 minute, would disagree with the point that America was founded by these people and their children, and a huge portion of them were not off on the frontier building towns from scratch that no white person had ever touched, but further developing a firmly established society. British America, the 13 colonies. These are immigrants. America was founded largely by immigrants. But this whole debate of settler versus immigrant that Pax Tube is making is dumb. These are just words that are missing the ideas at the heart of what this all means. Or the driving purpose of the first settlers and the first immigrants and those immigrants of a century later and 200 years later and even today is seeking a better and freer life for yourself. That's what America's about. That's the meaning of the term Nation of Immigrants, according to the guy who popularized the term, JFK. Also, I've got a problem with his number 2 point, but you know what? We're going to talk about that later. Let's keep going to see how he further develops his argument.
The fact that there was a relatively low number of new arrivals coming to the young US, combined with the fact that those who did come had to be incredibly competent to make the journey, is why the US had laxer immigration laws in its first few decades.
I can kinda see his first argument. I'd add that I doubt the colonial governments of the time really had the power or the ability to stop any immigration they didn't really want, but nobody can prove that. But point 2 doesn't really make any sense at all, because surviving a sea journey is not a measure of competence. You can be the smartest lad in the world, but it doesn't matter if your boat capsizes in the middle of the Atlantic. I can kinda see the argument that expensive sea journeys selected for people competent enough to have the money to pay for the journey, but if you remember from your high school history classes, and Pax Tube doesn't, there was such a thing as indentured servitude. Basically, you'd sell a contract for your labor for some period in exchange for passage to America. In fact, more than half of the European immigrants to the 13 colonies were indentured servants. So a huge portion of the earliest people to come to America were not fully free or rich by any means. They were poor people who sold themselves into servitude. I honestly don't really know what he means by highly competent, since the colonists didn't each have their own rowboats or go through an obstacle course to get to America. It's a historical fact. They were not all rich and successful. Pretending they were is probably based on biases against current immigrants, many of whom work in manual labor, just like indentured servants centuries ago though. Let's move on.
What's perhaps even more important to understand is that the early US had strict naturalization laws. Naturalization allowed someone to vote and become a citizen. Thus, those without naturalization had next to no political power. The Naturalization Act of 1790 restricted this naturalization to only free white people of good character who had been in the US for 2 years. In 1795, that requirement was up to 5 years. The act also required those being naturalized to renounce all allegiance to any foreign power or state. This law remained largely unchanged until 1870, when aliens of African descent were also given access to naturalization. This means that for the first 100 years of US history, immigrants were unable to become citizens or vote unless they were vetted Europeans who had lived in the country for 5 years. Does that sound like a nation of immigrants to you?
Yes. Just because naturalization laws were strict doesn't mean that America wasn't and isn't a nation of immigrants. What's more immigrant than pulling the ladder up behind you? Jokes aside, let's get some statistics. The 1850 census was the first time the US government figured out how many people were born abroad. They counted 2.2 million immigrants, so 9.7% of the total population of 23 million. The biggest immigrant sources, for fun, were Ireland, Germany, and England. I know Pax Tube functionally forgets this, but white people can be immigrants. But anyways, 9.7% doesn't really sound like a lot, right? How many immigrants do you think the US has today? Per the US Census's 2022 American Community Survey, the number is about 46 million. Now, that might sound like a whole bunch, but we also have a much bigger country today, with over 333 million people. So only 13.9% was born abroad, and more than half of those are already US citizens. So 9.7% in 1850 and 13.9% in 2022, that's not really that big of a difference. So Pax Tube is constructing this whole argument that immigration laws today are so crazy, it's just anarchy, modern mass migration, but it's really only a couple percentage points different from what it was in 1850. But in the end, he doesn't care about numbers, he cares about color. Oh, also, the 9.7% number obviously doesn't include the children born in America of immigrants who came to America. JFK includes those in his idea of the Nation of Immigrants, and that's mostly what we mean today too, isn't it? Let's just move on.
Now some may be thinking, okay, in the first 100 years of United States history, maybe it wasn't really a nation of immigrants. But surely by the turn of the 20th century, when passenger ships could bring thousands of people at a time to the US, that's when it became a nation of immigrants. After all, the Statue of Liberty was built in 1886, and the 1880s to 1910s saw huge spikes of immigration never seen before in United States history. This is when many people's ancestors, including some of mine, came to the United States.
Let's pause there for a second because this is pretty funny. I guessed Pax Tube was Italian, and I'm right. I don't believe for a second that he's going to watch this, so I'll address all the other Italian-American history nerds like myself. Don't listen to this guy. all the same vitriol that gets tossed at immigrants today is the same stuff that our grandparents or great-grandparents went through in their day. The largest mass lynching in American history occurred in 1891 in New Orleans, and it saw a mob murder 11 Italian Americans after several of them were determined innocent in a trial. That's just the loudest single incident in the gargantuan story of discrimination against Italian immigrants in America. You have to be a special kind of brainwashed to be the descendant of Italian and Irish immigrants in America and make a video that completely wipes out their contributions to this country, but not only that, recycles the same hateful rhetoric used against them against current immigrants. The same sort of stuff. History doesn't repeat, but it does echo, and it's echoing today. Now, does discrimination against immigrants, which definitely happened, help Pax Tube's argument? Immigrants obviously have faced immense hurdles in America, especially immigrants who weren't born British. So is America then not a nation of immigrants? Let's put it this way. If you have to struggle to get into a college, but you get in, does it mean you're not a student there? Immigrants pulling the ladder up behind them is not just a joke. Social groups want to reduce competition with each other. In 1924, it was English Americans whining about Irish and Italian immigrants. In 2024, it's Irish and Italian Americans whining about Mexican immigrants. And in 2124, it'll be Mexican Americans whining about, I don't know, Brazilian immigration or something.
However, that all being said, the idea that this immigration made the United States a nation of immigrants comparable to the modern context is still inaccurate. Let's get into why.
First of all, let's talk about the Statue of Liberty. Contrary to what some think, the Statue of Liberty was not put in place to be a symbol of the United States welcoming immigrants. The statue was, in fact, a gift to the United States from France in order to celebrate 100 years of American independence, as well as to commemorate the abolition of slavery. Keen observers may have known this from the broken shackles that can be seen near the statue's feet. Being unveiled in 1886, the statue came at the same time the U.S. was passing some of the most restrictive immigration laws in its history. Indeed, the poem that's regularly cited to connect the statue to immigration was not added until nearly 20 years later. Ultimately, immigration advocates citing the statue do it for sentimental purposes, not factual ones. It's a similar situation with the phrase E pluribus unum. This motto is referring to uniting the 13 colonies to declare independence. It had nothing whatsoever to do with immigration.
Returning to the main timeline, immigration into the U.S. did indeed rise greatly at the turn of the 20th century. But it's not as if Congress simply stood by while this happened. To respond to these increases, they passed a variety of immigration restrictions.
These included the Immigration Acts of 1882, 1907, and 1917. One highlight of the acts was creating new categories of immigrants who were completely inadmissible to the United States, such as, quote, any convict, lunatic, idiot, or person unable to take care of him or herself without becoming a public charge. The act ordered that these categories not even be allowed to enter U.S. land. These regulations were typically enforced at court for the judgment of immigration officers.
The 1907 Act was signed into law by Theodore Roosevelt, who was a firm supporter of assimilating new immigrants into American culture. He wrote, "Any man who says he is an American but something else also isn't an American at all. We have room for but one flag, the American flag. We have room for but one language, and that is the English language. And we have room for but one sole loyalty, and that is a loyalty to the American people." Roosevelt also stated his intention on preventing the United States from becoming a nation brought to ruins by a tangle of squabbling nationalities. And when we look at our country today, we see what he was referring to.
Okay, obviously Pax Tube is suggesting that we today are a tangle of squabbling nationalities, and America of the late 1800s and early 1900s was not. But knowing even a modicum of the history of Italian and Irish immigration into America would shatter this whole viewpoint that Pax Tube has. Who do you think Teddy Roosevelt was talking to? Let's talk about his quotes for a minute. What do you think he's arguing with these Teddy Roosevelt quotes? It seems to me like he's saying Roosevelt is right and that Roosevelt is saying the US should limit immigration to avoid becoming a tangle of squabbling nationalities. But if you look deeper than brainy quote and actually read the speech Teddy Roosevelt gave, he's arguing the exact opposite. That America should try its hardest to absorb immigrants, welcome them into this country, and avoid drawing lines between people. These quotes are from a 1915 speech Roosevelt gave to the Knights of Columbus, which is an Italian-American organization. If Pax Tube bothered to look at the speech, he'd see Roosevelt saying, "We should freely take from every other nation whatever we can make of use. Our nation was founded to perpetuate democratic principles. These principles are that each man is to be treated on his worth as a man without regard to the land from which his forefathers came and without regard to the creed which he professes." He goes on to say that the Know-Nothings, a nativist group that opposed immigration on the basis of religion, directly contravenes the spirit of the Constitution itself. Now, Pax Tube doesn't misquote him, he just takes him out of context. Roosevelt does go on to say that hyphenated Americans should naturalize and fully adopt their new American identity, but it goes both ways. He says, The one absolute certain way of bringing this nation to ruin, of preventing all possibility of its continuing to be a nation at all, would be to permit it to become a tangle of squabbling nationalities, an intricate knot of German Americans, Irish Americans, English Americans, French Americans, Scandinavian Americans, or Italian Americans, each at heart feeling more sympathy with Europeans of that nationality than with the other citizens of the American Republic. He doesn't exclude the earlier waves of Germans or Irish or English. He's saying that all Americans should be just as loyal to other ethnic groups in America as they are to their own. Sounds like a nation of immigrants to me. If you don't believe me, just listen to this part. We should meet this situation by, on the one hand, seeing these immigrants get all their rights as American citizens, and on the other hand, insisting that they live up to their duties as American citizens. Any discrimination against aliens is a wrong. I'll repeat that. Any discrimination against aliens is a wrong, for it tends to put the immigrant at a disadvantage and to cause him to feel bitterness and resentment during the very years when he should be preparing himself for American citizenship. He concludes his speech by saying, "If as a nation we are split into warring camps, if we teach our citizens not to look upon one another as brothers but as enemies, divided by the hatred of creed for creed, or of those of one race against those of another race, surely we shall fail." Now obviously, Teddy Roosevelt had his own issues with immigrants and non-white people, but if you actually look beyond the cherry-picked quotes to the whole speech Teddy Roosevelt is giving, it goes completely against Pax Tube's entire video. Roosevelt believes that America is a nation of immigrants, even if he's not using that specific term. He's saying immigrants should naturalize, yeah, but a huge burden in that process is on native-born Americans to accept immigrants regardless of where they come from. Also, I literally searched for just an extra 10 minutes and I found this 1905 speech Roosevelt gave to Congress. It is unwise to depart from the old American tradition and to discriminate for or against any man who desires to come here and become a citizen, save on the ground of that man's fitness for citizenship. It is our right and duty to consider his moral and social quality. That's what the 1907 law was about. It wasn't about race. And if you think he only means Western European Christians, Roosevelt continues, "We cannot afford to consider whether he is Catholic or Protestant, Jew or Gentile, whether he is Englishman or Irishman, Frenchman or German, Japanese, Italian, Scandinavian, Slav, or Magyar. What we should desire to find out is the individual quality of the individual man." Notice how he says Japanese there, Japanese people aren't white. If a politician said this today instead of 1905, Pax Tube would say he's in favor of mass migration and the destruction of America, or whatever. But let's fast forward a bit.
As if everything so far wasn't bad enough for the Nation of Immigrants narrative, things get even worse for it in the 1920s. In 1924, Congress completely overhauled immigration. It established a quota system that would put hard caps on immigration and allow in new ones based on the demographics of the 1890 census. The main effect of this was that immigrants from Western Europe received the largest portion of the visas. What Congress had decided was to set a clear demographic path for the United States and its future. The U.S. Office of the Historian puts it thus: "In all of its parts, the most basic purpose of the 1924 Immigration Act was to preserve the ideal of U.S. homogeneity." To Congress in the 1920s, it was common sense that genetic and cultural ties between people were the bedrock of prosperous nations. That sense is seemingly lost on many politicians and voters today.
If anyone doubted that Pax Tube's main gripe is not with immigration itself, but actually with non-white people, there you go, he just said it. That gives me a good opportunity to highlight a point that Pax Tube suggests throughout his whole video, that America was more unified when there were just European immigrants. It's obviously impossible to measure this objectively, because immigration is never the only thing going on that can make a society more unstable. I mean, America was 85% white in 1860, the year the Civil War broke out. But America in the late 1800s, when most immigrants were from Europe, was not more stable than today. Different European groups in America hated each other. Europeans have hated each other for centuries. They still haven't stopped blowing each other up after splitting themselves apart over minor linguistic differences. Those hatreds didn't just magically disappear when Europeans saw the Statue of Liberty. Conjuring up some imagined past where all these different European groups got along perfectly in the 1800s Garden of Eden thanks to shared European heritage, and then comparing that to some hallucination of the present day in America in the midst of a civil war because Latino immigration is wrong in both directions. I mean, the image he uses to prove that America is a
tangle of squabbling nationalities.
is from the George Floyd riots of 2020, which had absolutely zero to do with immigration at all. German and English Americans who didn't quite get along in the 1700s really despised Italian and Irish immigrants in the 1800s. They did not consider them racial equals, and there was often violence. If you check out the Italian Americans, there's a whole chapter on this called The Great Fear. The author writes, turbulent socioeconomic unrest characterized the America of the 1880s. The crippling depression of the decade, marked by internecine labor warfare in the cities and by agrarian ferment in the South and the Midwest, provided the socially corrosive background for a rising anti-Semitism, an emerging Jim Crowism, and a growing suspicion of European immigrants as radicals and criminals. The book points out that common beliefs held the new wave of Catholic immigrants to be inherently criminal or semi-barbarous, even though the immense majority were just normal people who worked hard, working-class jobs. As an example of this hysteria, in 1888, Buffalo arrested hundreds of Italians when one Italian killed a different Italian. This hysteric xenophobia was a motivation behind a huge wave of violence against Italian Americans in the 1890s. The mob just assumed the immigrants did the crime. The violence wasn't perpetrated by Martians, it was perpetrated by people descended from other European immigrants who did not view Italian American immigrants as equals. Remember that 1891 lynching I mentioned against a group of innocent Italians? When Roosevelt, who I've demonstrated to be pretty progressive on this whole immigration thing, heard about that lynching, he told the Italian diplomats present that he thought it was a rather good thing. This hysteria was not limited to just German and English Americans. Italian and Irish Americans were also at each other's throats. I can't even read some of the things they wrote to each other because YouTube will demonetize me. Here's how the author summarizes. Fearful of each other's economic competition and ignorant of each other's customs, America's poor, made up of native-born whites and blacks and various immigrant groups, lived in mutual distrust during the 1880s. Did these beliefs die in 1900? While violence did fade, prejudice did not go anywhere. The author writes, scholarly studies of immigration, published as late as the 1930s, had to assure their readers that sensational statements charging Italian immigrants with an aptitude for crime were without either racial or biological justification, since those beliefs were so widespread. So, what's my point? I'm not trying to paint Italian Americans today as some sort of persecuted minority.
It's anti-Italian discrimination.
My point is that if you believe that genetic and cultural ties prevented different European groups from butting heads in the past, I have a beachside property in Kiev to sell you. National conservatives like Pax Tube, who are terrified of America becoming more Hispanic, fail to see that the same sort of baseless mass hysteria and xenophobia that targets Hispanic immigrants today was used against his literal ancestors. As crazy as modern-day America is, America was even crazier 150 years ago. Now some comments are going to say that the hysteria is valid. It's not. Were the mafia and the Irish mob a problem? Are cartels today a problem? Sure, yeah. But let's keep that in perspective. They were not gargantuan organizations that threatened the very fabric of America, and they did not justify the wave of violence against immigrants in the 1800s. The same goes for today. It is an absolute fact that immigrants commit less crime than native-born Americans. But anyways, it's like what Teddy Roosevelt said a century ago. If you want immigrants to assimilate into the country's society, you can't persecute and discriminate against them, creating an excluded second class where some turn to crime or never identify themselves with America in the first place. You have to have a degree of openness and acceptance in your society, the sort of openness and acceptance that Pax Tube wants to get rid of, which would only exacerbate the problems he has with immigration. Anyways, let's fast forward through his video. He talks about the 1924 quota system, which cut immigration a whole bunch. He quotes paleoconservative Pat Buchanan.
They learned American literature, the American language, American history, American heroes. It is far more easy to assimilate if you had 1 million Englishmen coming into Virginia than if you had 1 million folks, 1 million Zulu from my friend Chief Butalese's tribe.
Now, it's an indisputable fact that immigrants from England or Canada are going to be able to assimilate into American society without much trouble just because there's so much shared culture. But all this hysteria about immigrants not assimilating into America has no basis in reality. There are a couple studies about this, including this one. The study's data shows that race, or how different your culture is from American culture, has very little to do with how easily someone can assimilate, since assimilation is not just about culture. He points out that Immigrants from Vietnam, Cuba, and the Philippines have some of the highest rates of assimilation, for example. Here's a quote I think stands out. Italian immigrants of 1895 to 1900 and of 1905 to 1910 are very poorly assimilated upon arrival, with index values quite similar to those of newly arrived Mexicans and Vietnamese in 1980 and 1990. Their progress in the subsequent decade is faster than that of recent Mexican immigrants, but slower than that of recent Vietnamese, with index values rising to the upper teens for both cohorts. Italian immigrants arriving between 1916 and 1920, a period when the overall flow of immigrants to the United States had slackened considerably, shows signs of rapid assimilation between 1920 and 1930, though still not as rapid as that exhibited by recent cohorts of Vietnamese immigrants. So this data shows that Italian immigrants of a century ago assimilated faster than some groups today and slower than other groups today. We don't live in especially exceptional times. While it might intuitively seem that Italians must have assimilated better than non-Europeans today, the data doesn't show that. But Buchanan and Pax Tube's point is also about race, right? Mexican immigrants are more culturally assimilated than Vietnamese immigrants. They have relatively normal rates of cultural assimilation, maybe because it's easier for Mexicans to adapt to American culture. But when you look at economic and civic assimilation, Vietnamese immigrants have higher rates, probably because Mexican immigrants come to this country for partially different reasons and they can travel back to Mexico easier. So my whole point with this section is that assimilation is not just about skin color, it's about how many people come, why they come, where they live, a whole bunch of different factors that, if you're really worried about immigrants not assimilating, you can address by things such as funding English language education, civics classes, and jobs programs. You don't have to cut immigration to tiny levels, you can get the positives of immigration, and there are positives, and avoid any negatives as well. But in any case, arguing that today is exceptionally crazy is just not accurate if you know anything about the history of immigration to the United States. Anyways, let's keep going.
By the 1950s, the US Census showed that the demographics of the country were still very similar to what they were in the 1920s. The census found that the US population was 87% non-Hispanic white, 10% black, while every other racial group made up just 3%. The country was also over 90% Christian, with 95% of those saying that religion was important in their lives. This highlights that for the previous 100 years, the immigrants had also been nearly entirely Christian.
Okay, let's talk about this for a second. So what? Why does it matter that America in 1950 was 90% white and America today is 70% white? What harm has this done? All Pax Tube has done is make broad gestures saying this change is bad while showing photos of riots that have nothing to do with immigration. Also, the fact that he's focusing on non-Hispanic whites in this section and throughout the whole video actually shows that he thinks there's some unbreachable divide between Mexicans and Americans. But if you remember, people a century ago thought that about Italian immigrants. Italian immigrants practiced a minority religion, Catholicism. They spoke a very different language, Italian, they looked different, and clearly there was a problem with organized crime to some degree. Now today we have Italian Americans like Pax Tube complaining about modern mass migration. Isn't that proof that America is a nation of immigrants? Also, about that Christian thing Pax Tube says, the decline of Christianity in America has very, very little to do with immigration. Instead, it's native-born Catholic and especially Protestant kids who are losing interest in organized religion. In fact, if you're worried so much about America remaining Christian, wouldn't it make sense to increase immigration from Christian places like Mexico? Nearly 30% of Catholics are immigrants. Now, a Protestant nationalist saying Catholic immigration is bad is at least coherent, but a Catholic nationalist saying Catholic immigration is bad, the only thing you have left there is skin color. In fact, I looked through his Twitter and he's posted this before. He says, "Unfortunately, it seems that Hispanics who come to the US do not make the country more Catholic, but instead the US makes them more non-religious." The first part of the sentence is obviously incorrect, because immigrants don't just suddenly shed their religion at the border. They stay, and it's their children who become less religious as a product of cultural assimilation to America. But on Twitter, someone pointed that out, and he admits he was wrong. He even argues with someone and says, Mexican Catholics are decently devout compared to other regions of the world. So what's his problem with Mexican immigration then? It's native-born American Protestants losing interest in going to church that's the source of this whole trend he has a problem with. Why bring up religion? Is it about Muslim people? 1% of America is Muslim, who cares? His videos just manipulated talking points with no connection to anything else. But okay, let's fast forward to the Cold War.
Throughout the 40s and 50s, US state secrets were rampantly being stolen by espionage rings, and many of those spies were either immigrants or children of immigrants. One of the most infamous examples was the case of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. The couple, as well as a ring of other immigrant-connected spies, were convicted in 1951 of providing classified information to the Soviet Union. Some of this stolen information involved the Manhattan Project, and its acquisition by the Soviets allowed them to complete their atomic weapon years ahead of schedule.
Pretty weird how he says immigrant connected when he's immigrant connected. Yes, it is true that the Rosenbergs were spies, but they weren't immigrants, they were the children of immigrants. Ethel's parents were born in Russia and Poland, and Julius's parents were also born in Russia. You know who else had immigrant parents? Oppenheimer. The entire nuclear program would have failed without immigrants. A lot of the people on the program were immigrants from Europe, fleeing people who implemented the policies that Pax Tube supports. Nowhere in the video does Pax Tube suggest America should have cut off immigration from Europe. And for anyone who's going to point out that the Rosenbergs weren't Christian, Oppenheimer wasn't either. You want to know another atomic spy who worked on the Manhattan Project and snuck info to the Soviets? Klaus Fuchs, a German who was 0% Jewish. Let's keep going though.
So, as the 1960s approached, the United States was still not a nation of immigrants in any meaningful way. Quotas had upheld the European and Christian character of the country, and even among those European immigrants, preference was given to the founding Western European stock. Native births had continued to drive the country's population increase, not immigration. The baby boom stands out as an example of this.
Okay, this is what I mean. He literally says the United States was still not a nation of immigrants, quotas had upheld the European and Christian character of the country. Those ideas are not related. Again, JFK was an Irish Catholic. The Nation of Immigrants idea is not just about non-white people. He has chapters on Irish Catholics in his book. I wonder, if the entire population of Britain, Ireland, Germany, and Italy all moved into the US in 1912, would Pax Tube call America a nation of immigrants then? This is what happens when your brain gets rotted by memes and hatred. This whole video is just entirely surface-level Wikipedia history and xenophobia. Anyways, let's fast forward. Here's his conclusion.
When the historical record is taken in full, the United States is not a nation of immigrants. What the United States is a nation of settlers, of pioneers, of builders, and most importantly, of the American people. A unique people descended from their old world ancestors and developed through the trials and tribulations of building a new nation.
Those are immigrants. Using his own definition, anyone who arrived after the country is firmly established is an immigrant.
And though the country has changed dramatically in the last 60 years of mass immigration, the truth of its roots remain the same. And we should acknowledge and protect these roots, even as forces attempt to change the United States into something unrecognizable from its past self. From a nation of Christians of European ancestry, into a nation in which both groups are declining as a portion of the population.
Immigration has nothing to do with any of the stuff he doesn't like. He has no evidence that immigration is actually bad for America, because if he did, he wouldn't use videos of black people rioting. The majority of black people aren't immigrants. This makes absolutely zero sense.
Though while our portion decreases, we shall endure, as will our history as long as brave souls are willing to protect it. And when the curtain is pulled back, those who would undermine these truths to peddle an ahistorical, pro-immigration narrative do not have the best interests of the American people or nation at heart. And now, with everything that's been presented to you in this video, you know the facts.
Okay, I think we've proven that he's very clearly trying to communicate a racial message, which is why he went on and on about European ancestry, but he's not bold enough to actually focus on that, so he's clumsily cloaking it in the question of whether America is a nation of immigrants. The millions upon millions of Europeans who came to this country, including Pax Tube's ancestors, were immigrants. He pretends that America back when it was 90% white was some sort of Garden of Eden, but European immigrant groups hated each other on the basis of their ethnicity, just as people like Pax Tube are panicking today about the ethnicity of the recent-most wave of immigrants. Americans are immigrants. Pax Tube is the descendant of immigrants, so am I. so is the vast majority of the population. I honestly doubt that anyone in this country is 100% biologically descended from the first families who stumbled off the Mayflower, because they'd be infertile from inbreeding pretty quickly, but maybe that's what Pax Tube prefers. Without immigration, America would be a tiny husk, completely unrecognizable. America is a nation of immigrants. That's all I have for you today. Don't forget to like and subscribe and support me on Patreon. Thanks to those who already do. User SEQ, Marklin, Sheba, Caliber, Lehan Whale, Gayatola Kulmani, Goblin Stack, Lily, 7-Zip, Bobby the One, Will, Destroyer of Opinions, Sean, Lars, Graham, Vantachromia, Haniel, Jared, Omega, Daniel, Quincy, Diamond Z, Dionisio, Wheatless, Amir, Chang, and Benjamin. Thanks and adios.